In each of the last 20 years, the country's cartoonists have captured the key moments of political drama and the burning social issues of the day with instantaneous clarity. These cartoons, now about 50,000 of them, are in the New Zealand Cartoon Archive at the Alexander Turnbull Library. I'm going to talk a little bit about editorial or political cartoons in general, and in New Zealand specifically, particularly during the 2 decades since Prime Minister Jim Bolger launched the Cartoon Archive on April 1, 1992. But on the assumption that context is always everything, I should start by saying a little bit about the history of editorial cartooning in New Zealand. From their beginnings here over 150 years ago, editorial cartoons have gone straight to the heart of issues. Cartoonists of every era are often the most acute interpreters of public opinion. As Nicholas Garland, who holds joint British and New Zealand passports, puts it, reflecting the anger, dismay or grief their fellows are feeling. The better educated of those settling here from 1840 onwards were familiar with the cartoon prints on sale on the streets and in the coffee houses of London and other British cities, and with Punch magazine, which first appeared in 1841. Copies of this, other magazines and newspapers regularly made the long sea voyage south, and it was not surprising that New Zealand's first political cartoons, as nearly everything else in the new colony, were careful imitations of the British models. Over 3 decades from the early 1860s, there were at least 8 local imitations of Punch, or the London Charivari, and for those puzzled by that word, it originally meant a discordant mock serenade to newlyweds. And these early Punch magazines in New Zealand ranged from bad and amateurish parodies to publications with a rough sort of colonial vitality. The humour, invariably as stiff and mannered as the drawings, was often buried in lengthy captions and generally depended on heavy-handed puns or complex classical or literary allusions. And all the local punches had short, if lively, lives, and most of the cartoonists were unknown. On the other hand, James Brown, probably the country's first cartoonist, was well known in Otago from the early 1850s. Glasgow-born Brown was a successful Dunedin engraver, but what survives today are some of his humorously observed caricatures of Otago identities. And that's the man who, Captain Cargill, allegedly coming ashore for the first time and having a rather mixed reception. Early newspapers left illustration of any kind to the magazines, which had more time for the laborious process of engraving on wooden blocks. It was only after the introduction of photo engraving in the 1880s that newspapers published occasional cartoons. It was, however, the new weeklies in the early 1890s, with their greater emphasis on social, sporting and cultural coverage, that began to use cartoons widely. William Blomfield, long-time editor and part owner of the Auckland-based Observer, was without a doubt the country's first great cartoonist. Blow, as he signed his cartoons, was not only prodigious, producing an avalanche of cartoons for over half a century, but he was one of the first to shrug off the prim, static, relentlessly crosshatch style of his cartooning predecessors. His work had a looseness of line and a vitality that links him to the leading cartoonists of today. Over the last century and a half, there have been some very impressive and some rather grey cartooning eras. There have been the great, the good, and the journeyman cartoonists. There have been international stars like David Lowe, and those today like Tom Scott, who have celebrity status. So there have been 3 particularly important eras in the New Zealand editorial or political cartooning story. In each case, there has been the happy coincidence of brilliant cartoonists and exciting political periods with larger-than-life personalities. The first of these periods was in the 1890s, through to the early 20th century. There were the lively weeklies, The Observer, New Zealand Graphic, Freelance and Auckland Weekly News, and excellent cartoons from people like E.F. Hiscox. That's a Hiscox cartoon there. He used to call himself always E.F. when he can get away with it, possibly because his first name was Elalucius, and I guess he preferred to be E.F. And there was Blow, who we saw before, and his brother J.C. Blomfield. It was this trio who best captured Premier Richard John Seddon's large, dominating personality, boundless egotism and energy as he stormed up and down the country promoting the groundbreaking policies of the Liberal government. The second principal era was between 1935 and 1949, and it had the same essential ingredients. The excitement and tension of the first reforming Labour government, with the charismatic Michael Joseph Savage. He doesn't seem very charismatic when you see him these days on newsreels, but he obviously appealed then. And then Peter Fraser, widely considered our best ever Prime Minister. And there were the cartoonists to do them justice, with our only cartooning knight, Sir Gordon Minhinnick, the most prominent. And I also had the opportunity later in life to see quite a lot of Gordon, and he wrote the introduction to my first book. And he certainly was a great cartoonist. Minhinnick was, at Lowe's prompting, offered the Evening Standard cartooning chair when Lowe left the London newspaper in 1949. But Minhinnick declined, staying a total of nearly 50 years on the New Zealand Herald. Given the daily pressures, it was remarkable that so many others did the same. Alan Patterson, a quarter century at the Dominion, and Eric Heath at the same paper for another 28 years. Neville Lodge, 41 years at the Evening Post, and Sid Scales, more than 30 years at the Otago Daily Times. Whatever else this might have signified, it certainly meant there was a dearth of local employment for cartoonists. And ambitious young cartoonists went to Britain and Australia. Lower side, the most successful on Fleet Street included Neville Colvin, that's one of Neville Colvin's cartoons, Keith Waite, Les Gibbard, and that Les Gibbard, many years editor, cartoonist on The Guardian, and that was at the time of the oil shocks in the early 1970s, and for a period Murray Ball as well. They understood the history, spoke the language, but couldn't be easily pigeonholed within the class system. They were outsiders with inside knowledge. And in Australia, successful practitioners included Noel Cook, George Finey, Tom Glover, and today Alan Moyer at the Sydney Morning Herald. And I just hope that with the announcement just yesterday that the Sydney Morning Herald is going to tabloid size, I hope they'll still give Alan's cartoons the space they deserve. Back home, our most recent important cartooning era stretched from the mid-1970s through to the early 1990s, when there was a fortuitous combination of one of the largest cadres of talented stay-at-home cartoonists for decades, with a period of convulsive and compelling politics. Robert David Muldoon, by sheer force of his abrasive personality, tried to insulate the country from international economic forces. And then Rogernomics swapped regulation for heady, unprecedented liberalisation. That, of course, is a Bromhead, and before that was one of Malcolm Walker's cartoons. During the 70s, the most perceptive and telling of the cartoonists was Peter Bromhead, particularly when he dropped an elaborate early style for a few incisive strokes of his pen. There was also Bob Rocky, Malcolm Evans, Malcolm Walker, Trace Hodgson, Jim Hubbard, Garrick Tremaine, Tom Scott, and more recently Chris Slane. The New Zealand Cartoon Archive was to begin life rather tentatively as this third era was fading. Why then was it important for New Zealand to have a cartoon archive? I can best explain this with a very, very short history of the archive. Many young people of my generation devoured comics. For some reason, editorial cartoons always had the same sort of fascination for me. When in the mid-1970s, National Business Review was sufficiently established to afford a cartoonist, I remembered that Lord Beaverbrook, the Conservative press baron, had employed David Lowe, a committed socialist, as Evening Standard cartoonist in 1927. The resulting cartoons were sharply at odds with the newspaper's editorial stance and regularly raised the collective blood pressure of its readers and boosted circulation substantially. Consequently, in 1975 at MBR, and I was one of the original directors, we employed Bob Brocky, a committed socialist, as cartoonist, and National Business Review's boardroom readership was regularly outraged. And yes, circulation was nicely boosted. In 1976, with this ingrained cartoon interest, politics studied at university, and at time directing artists and advertising agencies and tutoring young ones at Polytech, I was asked to write a cartoon history of New Zealand by an Australian publisher. The unauthorised version, published in 1980, received a tremendous sales boost and garnered much more publicity than would have otherwise been the case by being chosen as a book of the month in a marketing scheme which dragged New Zealand book selling into the 20th century, as Kate Fortune would confirm. I had agreed to write the book without checking to see that the country's research libraries, particularly the Alexander Turnbull, had neatly catalogued collections of cartoons. They didn't. What they had was a small assortment of cartoons collected haphazardly, most of them donations to the library. I still shudder to think of the time I spent at the Turnbull, then in the freelance building on the terrace looking at the local Punch magazines, and also in the below ground level newspaper stacks at the Parliamentary Library, going through hundreds of large bound volumes of newspapers. These I then carried up a spiral staircase and held them open with one hand while operating a microfilm camera with the other. It is amazing really that so few of the images in that first book were not very badly blurred. In the course of researching the unauthorised version, and you'll see the unauthorised is spelt with a Z, that was the Australian influence, and looking at thousands of cartoons and getting to know all the country's current cartoonists, I became increasingly aware of the very rich cartooning heritage New Zealand had. It was also obvious that at that time our historians had paid very little attention to the country's newspapers and even less to their very illuminating cartoons. The book was revised and updated in 1987, and by this time I had come to the conclusion, not entirely unaffected by the boxes of cartoons under every bed in our house, that New Zealand should have a cartoon archive, and the work of our cartoonists, present and past, deserved to be archived and cherished. By 1991, I had gathered sufficient support from politicians and others to underwrite the beginnings of a cartoon archive, and with the enthusiastic support of then Chief Librarian Jim Trowie, it found a home at the Alexander Turnbull Library. Why is it important to preserve and study editorial cartoons? M.K. Spielman, writing a book about Punch magazine in 1906, said, "The cartoon record of how public matters struck a people at the instant of their happening is surely not less interesting to the future student of history, of psychology and of sociology than the most official record of the world's progress." Thomas Kennetz, an American historian, wrote in 1973, "Cartoons can provide insights into the popular attitudes that underlay public opinion, insights that may be more difficult to glean from written material or from other evidence or behaviour." And our former Prime Minister, the very perceptive Sir John Marshall, called cartoons instant enlightenment. Cartoons reflect public opinion of any era in all its rawness, before the rough edges have been smoothed away in the official reports and documents that our historians relied on for so long. Got an historian in the audience tonight who might disagree with some of this. Spin doctors were here centuries before the expression was coined. The overt racism in New Zealand cartoons in the 1890s, and again after the First World War, is a case in point. These cartoons, and there were many of them, brought into sharp relief widespread prejudice at various times against Indians, Chinese and Jews, attitudes that didn't rate a mention in the standard histories written prior to the early 1980s. Traditionally, cartoons, that's by George Finey, who spent most of his career in Australia, but an excellent caricaturist. not one of his nicest cartoons. Traditionally, cartoons have had a sharper edge to them than the rest of the content in the newspapers and magazines that carry them. Nicholas Garland, the leading UK cartoonist who spent his formative teenage years in New Zealand, wrote, "Why is it that political cartoons are so highly valued by newspaper editors and readers? Part of the answer may be in the tradition that the views of the cartoonist may differ wildly from those expressed more formally elsewhere in the newspaper. From this particular freedom given to or seized by the cartoonist, cartoons derive a large part of their strength." And David English, editor of Britain's Daily Mail, has written, "The cartoonist, given that special licence granted over the centuries, can say things others only dare whisper." But perhaps the last word on the purpose and point of editorial cartoons can safely be left to David Lowe, our most illustrious cartoon export, and subject of Susan Foster's impressive cartoon archive exhibition, David Lowe, Kiwi cartoonist on Hitler's blacklist, opened by the Duke of Edinburgh in 1995. In 1942, Lowe wrote, "There may be many persons who still hold the absurd misconception that it is the cartoonist's business to be amusing and to confirm them in their prejudices. Their function is not to please but to provoke, for in this way they contribute to progress by shocking the indifferent into action and stirring fools out of their folly." Well, these are some of the reasons editorial cartoons are being taken more seriously today. There's a steady stream of MA and PhD theses using cartoons to explore a range of topics now being written in New Zealand. And for this reason, the Cartoon Archive has decided to publish a series of scholarly monographs at the other end of the publishing spectrum from the more popular books that we've published since 2001. The first of these monographs, A Cartoon War, based on an analysis of First World War cartoons and adapted from Sarah Murray's MA thesis, was launched at the Cartoon Archive's 20th anniversary function in early April. There are copies of the monograph outside, and there'll be somebody there even happy to sell you one afterwards. And I'd also say that at the time of our celebration in early April, we produced a special newsletter, which gives some more of the history of the Cartoon Archive, and there are copies out there of that, so please take one. Of course, New Zealand cartoonists have never had completely unfettered freedom of expression. This has always depended on the newspaper's editor, the proprietor, and the cartoonist's personality. The Otago Daily Times' Sid Scales used to say that particularly early in his career, he would attend the afternoon editorial meeting and be told what to draw. That was more than half a century ago, and it doesn't happen today. Editors certainly have veto power over any specific cartoon, but it's used sparingly. Legal complications or matter of taste are more likely to exercise them than subject matter or a cartoon's particular perspective. In 2004, when 3 police officers in Rotorua were being investigated for gang rape, Tom Scott came up with this alternative cartoon, which he later conceded was more effective, when Dominion Post editor Tom Pankhurst rejected the first cartoon submitted as being too overtly brutal. It has been claimed that Malcolm Evans' very public sacking as the New Zealand Herald's editorial cartoonist in 2003 was because he refused to modify the unwavering line he took on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and that the newspaper bowed to the pressure of the Jewish community's belief that his cartoons were anti-Zionist. Evans claimed, however, that his cartoons were anti-Israel, not anti-Zionist, and that his freedom of expression had been blocked. In general, editors and newspaper companies take comfort from the fact that while New Zealand politicians in particular have regularly sued the print and electronic media for aspersions supposedly cast, and some politicians, I think, believe that suing newspapers was a kind of superannuation scheme, much more hard-hitting and comment in cartoons have not received the attention of defamation lawyers. As Sir Geoffrey Palmer has said, the Press Council receives a number of complaints about cartoons, but that's usually as far as it goes. A cartoon is, after all, an analogy, and cartoonists are generally on safe ground as long as they express genuine opinions. There's never been a successful conviction of a cartoon in a New Zealand court. But the New Zealand Times was possibly sweating a little bit in 1985 when this cartoon appeared, when Trace Hodgson, a mild man with a savage pen, drew The Legend of the King Rat that led to a claim by Equity Corp and Chase for $10 million in damages. The cartoon, based on a Middle Ages legend, portrayed a number of fast-growing 1980s companies as voracious rats with entwined tails. It was a prescient cartoon. The case collapsed when the companies were share market crash casualties in 1987. Just last month, when the Dominion Post editor told me that a very recent Hodgson cartoon had caused a flurry of press council complaints, and I'm not surprised, I tried to comfort her with the thought that she, Fairfax and Trace did have history on their side. Generally, the most New Zealand cartoonists have to worry about is an irate phone call from a politician. Usually, though, however savage the cartoon, the call is from the minister's office wanting to buy the cartoon. As Sir Gordon Manhinnick, there he is lining up his next Prime Minister to cartoon. As Sir Gordon put it, since cartoonists thrive on the activities of politicians, and the volume of politicians shows no sign of decreasing, the ecological balance is properly maintained by a symbiotic arrangement whereby the organisms depend for their existence on the nourishment derived from each other. Cartoons hang on cabinet ministers' walls like so many hunting trophies. I think the belief is, and it might be true, that once you've been cartooned, and particularly when you don't need to be labelled, then you've truly arrived. Certainly cartoonists in some countries have a great deal more to fear than their New Zealand colleagues. This was very evident here in 2008 when the Cartoon Archive helped organise the International Cartooning for Peace Symposium. Cartoonists, particularly from the Middle East, talked nonchalantly about the daily risks they took with cartoons criticising dictatorial governments. It is nothing new. Much of the long-time opposition in the Soviet Union was fostered and inspired by underground cartoons. Cartoons, with their scalpel-sharp wit, are lie-piercing tools in the fight for human rights, and equally potent among the literate and, importantly, the illiterate. And they are universally feared by repressive regimes. Today, unfortunately, there are many examples of persecuted cartoonists. In Zimbabwe, Tony Nameti continues to cartoon after his office was bombed. He was threatened by government ministers and chased by a ZANU-PF mob. This year, an Iranian cartoonist, Mahmoud Shokrav, was sentenced to 25 lashes for a caricature of a local member of parliament. And last August, Ali Farzad, a famous Middle Eastern cartoonist, one of Syria's best-known cartoonists and famous for caricatures that have infuriated Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and now the Assad family, was badly beaten by masked gunmen, and both his hands broken to stop his cartooning. So that's been very recent. And that cartoon actually was by Israeli Michelle Kitchka, who spoke at the Cartooning for Peace event at the National Library in 2008. Fortunately, the closest we have come to situations that these cartoonists confront every day was here in 1951, during the waterfront dispute. Well, the newspapers were ordered to run only the government side of the argument in stories and cartoons. Illegal union bulletins carried the simple but graphically affected cartoons of Max Bollinger. I'm glad I've been able to mention him tonight, who had to draw straight onto wax stencils and to do all this in secret. Caricatures, as Ali Farzad has shown to his cost, can be the most effective of all cartooning skills. In fact, caricature, with its direct assault on the physical characteristics of politicians and other notables, long predates the cartoon. William Blomfield and E.F. Hiscox were excellent caricaturists, and in the 1890s, before photography was widely used, many New Zealanders formed their opinion of larger-than-life premier Richard John Seddon from the cartoons they saw. George Finey, we've seen one of his works already, very successful in Australia, produced memorable caricatures of our politicians in the 1920s. That, in case you don't realise, is Thomas Mackenzie, who was our Prime Minister for barely 3 months in 1912. While most cartoonists today are satisfied with a reasonable likeness, some, like NBR's Bob Rocky, are first-rate caricaturists, and there is none better than Murray Webb, who has devoted his impressive career to caricaturing politicians, sportspeople and personalities. So the politicians are very important to the cartoonist, as Menhinnick said. The end of Muldoon's career particularly was lamented by cartoonists. He dominated cartoons as he did the politics of the country, and even mild-mannered cartoonists like Eric Heath drew him with more venom as the years passed. That's the way that Heath drew him between 69 and 70. And I asked Eric to put that together after observing how he had rather changed over the years. And for those of you who know Eric, he is a mild man. Today, John Key, with his bland, regular features, has been a real challenge to cartoonists. With an elongated nose, the usual but not entirely satisfactory solution. I must say I've noticed that Key has been attacked by the cartoonists much more this year than last. And in the past, that's been a barometer of community feeling often more telling than the results of polls. And when the PM starts attacking the media, it may be just a little bit more than a straw in the wind. I should say a little more about the Cartoon Archive before a quick glimpse at just a few of those almost 50,000 cartoons collected by the archive during the last 2 decades. The 3 Alexander Turnbull Library chief librarians over the past 20 years, Jim Trowie on the right, Margaret Corder and Chris C.K. have all been willing and enthusiastic contributors to the Cartoon Archive's success, as have been the principal Cartoon Archive staff members over that period. Susan Foster in the middle, Rachel McFarlane on the right, and Pauline Hanna on the left. In a way, most interesting about the first years of the Cartoon Archive was that before the term became fashionable, and often viewed with suspicion, it was a very successful public-private partnership. The running of the archive was shared between the Cartoon Archive Trust, which raised money to fund day-to-day operations and to publicise the collection, and the Turnbull Library, which processed, indexed, conserved and archived the collection. After Margaret Corder took over from Jim Trowie, we appointed Susan Foster as our first curator-manager, and the archive settled physically into the Turnbull Library's Drawing and Prints Department under Marion Minson's overall supervision. It was a harmonious and productive partnership. I had coerced a number of prominent business, legal and media people to sit on the trust, and we collected enough sponsorship to fund the archive's first exhibitions. There was even a charity auction, a cartoon auction at Government House in 1997. We made a particular point of every time there's a new Governor-General, we asked him or her to be our patron. There's the Governor-General, Sir Michael Hardy Boys and wife in the middle, and on the left, second left, Tom Scott, Ian Fraser, next to the Hardy Boys, and Mike Robson, who was the Managing Director of INL on the right.
The woman in the red jacket?
The woman in the red jacket, well, we've seen her before, but that's Susan Foster, who was our manager. And that raised $25,000 that rather hilarious evening at Government House. But in 2005, full control of the Cartoon Archive passed to the Alexander Turnbull Library. With the trust wound up, a new committee, the Guardians of the New Zealand Cartoon Archive, was set up to support the exhibition and book publishing program. And now, in conclusion, a few memorable cartoons that will stir some memories, cartoons about the politics and some of the social issues of the last 2 decades. I apologise to the Queen's Counsel in the audience. Clearly the cartoon archive can be considered successful in terms of the size and richness of its collection. Right from the start, cartoonists, all their publications arranged for copies and sometimes originals of their cartoons to be regularly dispatched to the archive. Today they nearly all arrive in digital form, which means they're available to be viewed by writers, researchers and members of the public that much sooner. Also today, the guardians of the cartoon archive administer the funds that have come from exhibition and book profits. There have been 14 exhibitions to date, 6 books and 1 monograph. That's a rather special cartoon, isn't it? And the Guardians will continue to plan more books, exhibitions and events in the future. It is the role of the New Zealand Cartoon Archive to not only collect and archive the work of our cartoonists, but it's equally important to continue to showcase those cartoons in exhibitions and books. To amuse, certainly, but to also reinforce their important contribution to us all having a better, clearer understanding of our history and of our society today. Thank you.